Born in 1952 in the small town of Klingenberg in Bavaria, Germany, Anneliese Michel was raised as a strict Catholic and was described as very bright and likable. In September 1968, when Anneliese was 16 years old, she experienced her first episode of losing consciousness, and later that night, she felt as if something was pressing down on her chest, pinning her to her bed. 11 months later, in August 1969, a similar event occurred, and her mother took Anneliese to their family doctor, Dr. Vogt, and a neurologist, Dr. Luthi, who examined her and even ran an EEG, a brain scan, but found nothing wrong. They hypothesized that it could possibly be a form of seizure. Over the next 3 years, Anneliese would have 2 more similar episodes and was prescribed 2 medications, an anticonvulsant medication and an anti-seizure medication called Dilantin. On both occasions, an EEG would come back normal, with some minor irregular patterns, but nothing that would definitively explain her symptoms. It was in spring 1973 that things took a turn for the stranger. Anneliese began to hear knocking sounds in her bedroom, sounds her sisters would hear as well. But even more alarming, Anneliese also reported hearing a voice damning her to hell. Her mother was further rattled when she witnessed Anneliese furiously staring at a statue of the Virgin Mary with, quote, eyes turned black, jet black, and her hands seemed to turn into thick paws with claws. In 1973, in a neurological visit with Dr. Luthi, Anneliese described horrific visions of demon faces that were tormenting her and stated that she felt the devil was inside her. She also reported smelling something that had the aroma of burnt feces, a stench that many around her would report smelling at later times. Around this time, Anneliese's mother described these strange occurrences to Dr. Luthi, who, according to Mrs. Michel, advised them to consult a Jesuit, a claim that Dr. Luthi would later deny. Whether or not that's true, the family definitely searched for a priest and eventually found a priest named Father Alt. In November 1973, Anneliese met with a Freudian psychiatrist who diagnosed her as a neurotic with possible epilepsy, and another neurologist found she had, quote, epileptic patterns, and took her off Dilantin and put her on Tegretol, a much stronger drug. In July 1975, Anneliese's extremely odd behavior worsened. She barely slept and prayed fervently all night. She ate spiders and flies, and even licked her own urine up from the floor. She destroyed rosaries, crucifixes, and holy pictures on the walls. Anneliese also exhibited strength that was, quote, close to superhuman, throwing her sister, quote, as if she were a rag doll, and incredibly was observed effortlessly squeezing an apple with one hand until, quote, fragments exploded throughout the room. A priest named Father Rodewick, a man considered an expert on exorcisms by his peers, reported that he was convinced that Anneliese was possessed, and after deliberation with the bishop, an exorcism on Anneliese was formally approved. It was to be carried out by a priest named Father Renz. On September 24th, 1975, the first exorcism rite was performed. Father Renz allowed some of the exorcism sessions to be recorded, and 42 audio recordings of the exorcisms were made in total. I'm gonna play some clips from those recordings, but fair warning, these recordings are perhaps the most disturbing pieces of audio I've ever heard.
Wann bist du überhaupt hier?
Ich hab recht so, dass ich in dem Wald rein bin. Ich trag dir die Rotznase noch so lang, bis es lebt wird. Die saublöde Weib. Für uns geht's kein Zurück. Nee! In alle Ewigkeit!
Sag mir den Namen.
Ich, der Judas, und der Nero, der Kain und der Hitler. 5 Stimmen.
Das ist der 6.
Oh, den haben wir gelogen.
Den habt ihr natürlich auch.
Anneliese also named Fleischmann as one of her demons and provided accurate details of the real Fleischmann, who was a priest in the 1500s that was kicked out of the church for bad behavior. These details came as an icy shock to Father Alt, who claims Anneliese would have no way of knowing Fleischmann. By May, Anneliese became even worse, banging her head against the wall and biting herself and others, to the point where her family had to tie her up to prevent her from hurting herself. But most dangerously, Anneliese refused to eat. She described it as, quote, not being permitted to eat. Despite being quite frail, likely weighing under 80 pounds, she exhibited great strength when people tried to restrain her. By June, Anneliese's entire face was sunken. She also refused a doctor visit, even though she had a very high fever. On June 30th, Anneliese had another exorcism, only saying please, absolution. The next morning, her family went to her room and found her dead. Despite seeking medical attention early on, Anneliese refused to submit to medical attention in the end, as she and her family ultimately placed all faith of recovery into the exorcisms. She died of starvation at the age of 23 after 67 exorcisms, weighing only 68 pounds at the time of her death. After her death, Anneliese's parents and the two priests were accused of negligent homicide, and the case went to trial in 1978. What follows are the two sides of that case. First, let's review the position of the defense. The defense presented eyewitness testimony and formally submitted the recordings as evidence of possession, an idea that the court never seemed to take seriously. From a non-religious standpoint, the defense argued Anneliese was permitted to deny medical treatment, as was her lawful right. For what it's worth, medical treatment might have included tranquilizing her, force-feeding her, and electroshock therapy. Quote, all presumably against her will, end quote. Family friend Thea Hine recalled in her testimony that in 1976, a few months before Anneliese's death, Anneliese reportedly, quote, begged on her knees for Hine to not suggest medical attention to anybody. Also worth noting is the fact that Father Alt actually looked for medical help towards the end. And on May 30th, his friend Dr. Richard Roth visited Anneliese out of what he claims was scientific curiosity and not as a physician. In his visit, Dr. Roth claims Anneliese had no external injuries, although Father Renz noted she had several bruises, a swollen cheek, and black eyes. An interesting contradiction, to say the least. Dr. Roth also denied saying, quote, there are no injections against the devil, end quote. Curiously, in spite of all the supposed epileptic attacks, an autopsy revealed Anneliese had a healthy brain with no damage that could have caused epileptic seizures. Quote, not even on a microscopic level, end quote. And even more curious was the court's seeming non-consideration of facts such as her pupils being unusually dilated and the absence of ulcers on her body, which are frequently found in victims of starvation. Now, let's review the position of the prosecution. The prosecution argued that Anneliese had epilepsy and psychosis, and that the parents and two priests were liable for failing to act to save her life. The defense tore down notions of possession. They questioned the credibility of Father Alt, with the conclusion from two experts that Father Alt exhibited signs of schizophrenia. The prosecution also argued that the medications given successfully suppressed the epilepsy-like seizures, and argued that that suppression morphed into, quote, a delusional psychosis associated with epilepsy, end quote. They argued that Anneliese's psychosis was exacerbated by the exorcism, which only played into her fantasy. To piggyback on that, Anneliese often went through phases between exorcisms where she behaved normally, even though she would behave as a possessed person during exorcisms. It's unclear if the epilepsy-like seizures were stopped by medication or if they actually stopped on their own, but Anneliese's psychotic visions predate the alleged medical suppression. In the end, the court ruled in favor of the prosecution, sentencing the four defendants to 6 months in prison with suspension for 3 years and payment for all court costs. The court ruled that Anneliese was unable to make decisions for herself and should have been forced to submit to medical care. Professor Felicitas D. Goodman, an author of a book on the case, notes the theories that Anneliese was epileptic were presented as, quote, a statement of undisputable fact, not conjecture, as in fact they had been, end quote. Regardless of the court ruling, many have debated what actually led to Anneliese's death. Was it a case of mental illness, possibly epilepsy? Or was this a legitimate case of demonic possession? Whatever the real reason may be, the case of Anneliese Michel is a tragedy and will always remain unsolved.